In case you couldn't tell by looking behind me, I enjoy Final Fantasy. A lot. And I'm not alone. Final Fantasy has been considered one of the biggest names in the RPG genre for almost 30 years now, but that wasn't always the case. Let's start off by taking a glimpse at the series' humble beginnings. In the long-lost time known only as the 1980s, a man named Hironobu Sakaguchi was struck with an idea. Inspired by games like Dungeons & Dragons and Wizardry, he put in a request to his employer, Square, asking for the opportunity to work on an RPG of his own, and was promptly denied. It wasn't until Square saw the success of rival company Enix's own RPG, Dragon Quest, that they finally gave Sakaguchi the green light, and a small team began working on the first title in what would become a monolithic series. And Final Fantasy really has become mythic in nature. Even the origin of the game's title has become legendary, with multiple stories popping up about where it truly came from. One of the most popular stories came from the mouth of longtime series composer Nobuo Uematsu, who insists the name Final Fantasy came from the fact that Square was on the verge of bankruptcy. Series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi disagrees, however, stating that the name was created simply because the abbreviation FF sounded good in Japanese. In fact, the game was originally going to be called Fighting Fantasy, but was changed to avoid potential copyright issues with a pen and paper game of the same name. On the other hand, Sakaguchi has also stated that if the title were to have failed, it would have meant his retirement from the game industry. Whatever the true reasoning, the name stuck, and in 1987 it was released in Japan, performing well enough to warrant a release of the game overseas in 1990. While some of you, like myself, may find this history interesting, that isn't what this video is primarily about. My primary goal with these videos is to critique and analyze the series, and I thought it was only fair to give each entry as much of a leg up as I can in proving whether or not they still hold up today. The only problem is, I feel that Final Fantasy has two definitive versions, each for completely different reasons. That means I had no choice but to make the first entry of Stiles series Synopsis of Final Fantasy a double feature. Let's start with the Origins edition of Final Fantasy for the PlayStation, as it most closely resembles the original NES release. As soon as you begin the game, you are offered the choice of two difficulty settings, an easy and normal mode, the second of which reflects the difficulty of the NES version is a choice I made for this review. After all, as I said before, that's exactly what makes the Origin version so appealing, the fact that it's the most polished version of the game that still remains faithful to its original 1987 release. This isn't the only choice you will be making that determines the game's difficulty, however. As soon as the game begins, you will be given the opportunity to create your party by selecting 4 characters from a total of 6 possible classes. This feature alone gives the original Final Fantasy more replay value than the majority of the later entries in the series do. For the sake of this review, I went for a well-rounded party that roughly fits what I expect most people would choose to play with: a warrior, white mage, black mage, and my personal favorite class, the red mage. After choosing your characters, the game begins, and from there you'll be presented with the standard RPG formula, though that makes sense considering the fact that Final Fantasy is one of the games that helped set the standard in the first place. I won't be focusing on explaining basic mechanics because I'm assuming the majority, if not all, the people who watch this video will be familiar with turn-based RPGs to at least some extent, so I'll be skipping to some more specific elements of Final Fantasy's gameplay instead. As stated above, Final Fantasy took inspiration from games like Wizardry and Dungeons & Dragons, and while that is obvious in many ways, I feel the most interesting carryover comes from the dungeon design philosophy. While yes, many of the dungeons are maze-like in design and contain many dead ends in both games, what is more interesting to me is how the dungeons are balanced. The game's dungeons are more of an endurance test than anything, a means of wearing down your resources and spell charges so that by the time you get to the bosses, they will be all the more difficult. This may sound obvious, but it's a mentality that has been abandoned in later games in the series. It's a little hard to explain, but in Final Fantasy, and to a lesser extent Final Fantasies 2 and 3, the bosses and dungeons are seen as one unit, and the difficulties were considered simultaneously to form a more balanced experience. Conversely, later games in the series generally have extraordinarily weak fights on your path through the dungeon, while the bosses themselves are astronomically more difficult by comparison. The Ice Cave is just one example of this. Seriously, I died more times in this one cave than I ever did against any bosses in the game. While it isn't a difficulty spike I'll defend, it still helps to prove my point in the way dungeons are laid out. Now, why is this important? Because it creates a scenario where death is a possibility during all encounters. It comes down to far more than just the current engagement. It involves spell charge conversation, item rationing, knowing when to pick your battles and when to flee. It makes for a much more rewarding overall experience in my eyes when the dungeons themselves are a threat and not just the bosses at the end. It makes the game feel downright tense at times, especially when you take into account that you can only save at ends and when using a tent on the world map, meaning if you die, you're starting the whole dungeon over again. I will admit that compared to modern games, the combat often feels rather bare bones, and most of the time your most efficient means of taking down your enemies will just be using the attack command. Then again, some of the enemies are strong enough that I had the desire to cast a protect spell in random battles or buff up my heavy hitters with some strength improving magic, which is something I can't say about any of the later games in the series. On top of that, the dungeons are speckled with harder encounters that always had me frantically attempting to dispatch them as quickly as possible because they could be downright devastating to my party. I guess what I'm trying to say is, though the combat isn't deep, the enemies are strong enough that the combat still feels satisfying. I should warn you, however, that these battles will be happening often, as the game has a pretty high encounter rate, but the quick and efficient combat means that it was never really something that I became frustrated with. Now, I can willingly admit that the lack of truly epic boss encounters is a bit disappointing now that I've grown accustomed to the massive power struggles that newer games throw at you, but creating a more interesting balance between the two would make for a much more gratifying combination. That's not to say that Final Fantasy is the king of game balancing. In fact, it is far from it. The 6 character classes you choose at the beginning of the game run the gamut from overpowered to completely useless. There's also a usefulness curve when comparing magic power to melee power in the game, with magic beginning the game by being only slightly more powerful than physical attacks, but slowly becoming less and less useful in terms of offensive output. By the end of the game, your offensive mages will be useful only for quickly dispatching weak enemies in random encounters. And while we're on the subject of magic, that's not the only way Final Fantasy's magic system is lacking, as a large chunk of the available spells are nearly useless. Though, for being fair, the same can be said of the vast majority of the games in the series. Why would you waste a round casting sleep on an enemy when you could just kill them outright? This is a repeated issue and one that affects a great deal of RPGs, so it isn't something I'm going to be harping on here, but it's still something I felt was worth mentioning. Despite all of this, the dungeons aren't your biggest obstacle here. The player's biggest adversary in Final Fantasy is a lack of direction. The game often doesn't tell you directly where to go next and will force you to do your own exploration, but even thorough players will often be granted only vague hints as to their next destination. Almost everyone I know who has played this game has gotten stuck at some point because they just weren't sure where to go next, and this can be incredibly frustrating. While the game is cryptic, it is not insurmountable. Just know that if you do get lost, there's no shame in looking up a walkthrough for this title. I also have to sadly admit that Final Fantasy is a rough start with some god-awful pacing. The first hour or so of the game is fine, but by the time you reach the third town, the game throws up a roadblock that will force you to grind for hours if you want to properly be prepared for the following dungeons. It's a shame because the rest of the game moves at a wonderfully brisk pace. If you get to the section of Feel Your Resolve wearing thin, I implore you to push through. You never have to subject yourself to this kind of grinding again in the game. It's interesting when I look back at these notes because most of the things I've listed have been negative things, and yet this is one of my favorite games in the series. I think it all comes down to the fact that these issues are mostly just a sign of the game's age and commonplace in almost all RPGs at that time. So if you struggle with older titles in the same vein, then Final Fantasy definitely won't change your mind, even with its fancy new coat of paint. Which brings me to the game's presentation, which is fine? Of course, all things are subjective, especially in terms of visual design, but I must admit I've been spoiled by the superior graphical design of the game's 20th anniversary remake. Things here are still a large upgrade from the NES original, which I appreciate, and I do like that the game remained true to its 2D roots. It also has a new CGI intro, which is cool I suppose, but I guess I just don't have a lot to say about it if I'm being honest. Oh, here's something. The one place I feel this version of the game's presentation really excels is in its use of color. The game uses muted tones that really help to sell the fact that the world is in peril. This is the only way that I feel the game's presentation may actually be superior to the newer PSP iteration, which I agree isn't necessarily a fair comparison, but hey, I did tell you I was searching for the definitive version, so all is fair here. Anyway, the game's palette not only reflects the state of the world, but it's also a great visual representation of this version's gameplay. It's not a whimsical adventure, but a treacherous journey, and I appreciate how these touches blended together. The soundtrack is also a huge plus. Final Fantasy is a series known for its music, and this is the soundtrack that started it all. While it isn't filled with the emotional melodies that we've come to expect, all of the songs feel appropriately exciting, mysterious, and grand in the moments that they should, and the CD quality arrangements created for this version add to the appeal even more. Much like the rest of the game, the soundtrack is simple but memorable. Alright, I'm going to begin talking about the story now, so spoilers? Though there isn't much to spoil if I'm being completely honest, but, well, that's up to you. Final Fantasy is a series that has become synonymous with storytelling, with both famous and infamous examples of it throughout its lineage. But the original entry didn't have much of a story at all. Hardware limitations at the time encouraged the creators to develop the world and gameplay first, only filling in plot whenever they had the ability to. And if we're being honest, the story does kind of feel like an afterthought. The game follows the 4 Warriors of Light as they travel the world to restore 4 crystals representing the weakened elements of the planet, and that's basically it. It is simple and effective, and the fact that the game is light on story actually helps the game's pacing a great deal, making it so you are always close to entering the next dungeon, which I appreciated. It's a bit sad that it's a rarity for an RPG to rely on its gameplay to drive the experience forward instead of its story, but that's what the original Final Fantasy did, and it does so successfully. That having been said, while the game is light on story, what is here is actually executed fairly well. Don't get me wrong, the story clearly isn't brilliant, but I do appreciate the attention to detail. When the game begins, you are tasked with traveling to the Chaos Shrine to defeat a swordsman named Garland, who's kidnapped the Princess of Cornelia. This task is easily completed within the first few minutes of the game, and in a not so subtle but brilliantly poignant bash against Dragon Quest, the opening credits are then played, signaling just the beginning of your adventure. Which, by comparison, this quest made up the entirety of Dragon Quest's adventure. I know I'm far from the first person to bring this up, but between this and the infamous Here Lies Link tombstone, Square was clearly not pulling any punches against its competition. But more importantly, it truly was an epic start to the game and a perfect introduction for all of the games to come. From there you continue on your journey, defeating the 4 elemental fiends and restoring the power to the world's 4 elemental crystals, only to find that all their power is being funneled into one location, the Chaos Shrine, where you first fought Garland. When you re-enter, you find a portal that sends you 2,000 years into the past, and after traversing the final dungeon, you find Garland once more, this time taking on the form of the mighty Chaos. You learn that he and the 4 fiends were working together and constructed a never-ending time loop where the fiends would revive him after you defeated him initially and thwart his kidnapping, so that he can gain power and send the fiends forward in time once more, and so on. Of course, in the end you defeat Chaos, destroying the time loop once and for all and finally ensuring the world's safety from that point forward. As stated before, the main story is about a never-ending time loop. It's a time paradox of unimaginable proportions, and while that in itself may bother some and just be waved away by others, it was an incredibly interesting idea for the time. Even if you dislike the idea of the time loop altogether, I feel that the way it was executed was rather well done. It is reflected in the gameplay by the Chaos Shrine being both the first and last dungeon the players will visit. It's also a great way to remind players of the long journey they've been on and give them some insight into how powerful they've become should they run into a random encounter while re-entering the shrine. Instead of just talking about how the story is cyclical, they went all out and actually implemented it into the gameplay, and that is something I greatly appreciate. While not the best entry in the series, or even a remarkable RPG by today's standards, Final Fantasy remains a highly entertaining game to play through. It's also not very long. My playthrough clocked in at about 15 hours, making it a great RPG to play when you are short on time. Now that we have the Origins Edition out of the way, it's time to move on to the PSP 20th Anniversary Edition. For the sake of critique, I decided to go with the exact same party build on my second go-around so that I could remove as many variables as possible when comparing the two versions to one another. And speaking of version differences, it takes only a cursory glance to notice that the presentation in the Anniversary Edition is superior in terms of graphical detail, font style, and translation. The whole package is just far more sleek than the previous iterations. So sleek in fact that I honestly find this to be one of the most aesthetically pleasing games in the entire series. Now obviously this game is nowhere near as complex graphically as later entries, but sometimes less is more. There's just something beautiful about the simplicity here. I love that they kept the presentation in 2D to retain the original style and somehow made all the models pop despite their lack of animation. The vibrant colors make the world feel inviting, and the small touches such as the embers in the foreground of Mount Galug just add to that appeal. The PSP version of the game retains the same music recordings that the Origins versions used, which I see as a bonus. If anything, the soundtrack's optimistic feel fits even better in this version than the last because it matches the vibrant visual design. On top of the initial soundtrack comes renditions of songs from newer Final Fantasy games repurposed for use in this version's bonus dungeons, but more on that later. Overall, the presentation for the PSP version just feels welcoming and comfortable. It is perfect as a means of reflecting the type of experience you are in for by remaining both humble and polished. Being a remake, this game remains highly similar to its previous iteration. The dungeon layouts are the same, battles play out in a similar fashion, and of course the story won't be taking any twists that weren't already there to begin with. There are a few small tweaks, however, that have an enormous impact on the game, especially in terms of difficulty. They have such a large impact, in fact, that I hesitate to call them all improvements. On the positive side of things, you gain experience in Gil at a faster rate, which makes grinding a whole lot less painful, though that first quarter can still be a tough section to push through if you are impatient. You also have access to a defend command on the battle screen, giving your mages something more useful to do while you're trying to conserve MP during battle. Add in the ability to save anywhere in the game, as opposed to just resting at inns or in a tent like in the Origins version, and you have a more user-friendly experience overall. The game also gives you access to all the restorative items that have now become series staples, Phoenix Downs, High Potions, Ethers, etc., which can make the game quite a bit more user-friendly for those who like to be more prepared for their travels. The easy allocation of items, however, is a double-edged sword depending on what you like in a game, because having a huge stockpile of healing items at your disposal makes a lot of the long dungeon treks that were a challenge in the previous version a breeze here. The same Same goes for the new magic system, which throws out spell charges for the more common MP pool, meaning that there is no penalty for constantly using your most powerful spells instead of having to ration out your spell charges until you get to the dungeon's boss. To be fair, these complaints do depend on what type of gamer you are. If you're a power gamer that loves to steamroll your competition, then none of this will likely bother you. But if you're the type of gamer who is looking for at least a bit of adversity, you will likely be disappointed by the PSP version's main campaign. Though the game does make up for at least some of its lack of difficulty with the inclusion of the game's 5 bonus dungeons. The first 4 bonus dungeons are unlocked as you restore each crystal and are themed accordingly. The dungeons have pre-created floors, but said floors are placed in a random order each time you enter, which alters what available treasures there will be and encourages re-exploration, which is good considering the fact that you will have to travel through most of these dungeons more than once if you plan on fighting every available boss in the game. And longtime fans likely will want to fight them all, because the most interesting aspect of these dungeons is that the bosses take the forms of popular bosses from Final Fantasies 3, 4, 5, and 6, which gives a great deal of fan service as well as offering entertainingly challenging fights to this rather simple game. Not to mention the extra bosses contain remixed versions of the original battle themes, which are all kick-ass. Sorry for geeking out there. These dungeons have the potential of skewing the game's balancing even further off course, however, depending on if you explore them immediately as they become available, or wait till post-game. If you take on the dungeons immediately, then there will likely be thrilling experiences that really showcase this version's peak in quality as they were balanced with the newly implemented systems in mind. But doing so means you will surely be overpowered for the main adventure. On the other hand, if you wait until post-game to explore these dungeons, then the first 2 bonus dungeons will be far too easy for you to remain entertained. But the last 2 may still pose a fun and interesting challenge. Either way, the game forces you to hamper your experience in one way or another, and that is a shame. The final and most creative dungeon of the 5 is known as the Labyrinth of Time. Instead of being your standard dungeon crawl, in the Labyrinth of Time you are forced to complete multiple challenges that range from mazes to block puzzles to memory tests. If this weren't enough, you are timed on each of these challenges, and the amount of time you are given to complete each one is determined by what character abilities you're willing to temporarily give up. It was a great change of pace from the rest of the dungeons in the game, and it reminded me how much I miss puzzle solving in modern games. When you do get to the end of the dungeon, you'll be presented with the game's super boss, Chronodia, or at least one version of it. There are multiple versions of Chronodia, and which one you face will depend on your success or failure in the dungeon's earlier challenges. This dungeon was simultaneously one of my favorite parts of the game and also the most headache-inducing, as I insisted on getting the perfect run that would lead me to the hardest version of Chronodia. I loved the creativity presented in the challenges, despite a few making me want to rip my hair out, and I adored the stress, the time limit, and ability loss placed on the events as well. If you enjoy bonus content in your RPGs, I highly recommend the Anniversary Edition, as the bonus content arguably outshines the main game. Well, there you have it. An in-depth look at 2 different versions of Final Fantasy. I'm still rather conflicted on which of the 2 versions I prefer, because I do genuinely enjoy both. I absolutely love the improved presentation in the Anniversary Edition, but the new magic system and changed difficulty leaves the game feeling completely unbalanced. The bonus dungeons arguably make up for that and are where the real meat of the gameplay lies, but it leaves the main journey feeling a bit lacking. On the other hand, the Origins version is much weaker in terms of presentation, has far less content, is rather clunky, and overall less streamlined, but it's also more well-balanced, more challenging, and more rewarding when it comes to the core experience. That is, if you have the patience to push past the opening grind, which is far worse than the Anniversary Edition. In this particular case, I hope I've given enough information for newcomers to decide for themselves which version they would like to play, should they decide to take the plunge, that is. And I feel that RPG fans should take that plunge. While it is simplistic and has a few old-school design quirks that may annoy some players, overall the game is still surprisingly strong as long as you know what you're in for. It's rare to have RPGs that are pushed forward by their gameplay instead of their story, and Final Fantasy succeeds at doing so. Given how readily available the game is to purchase in the short but satisfying playtime, I see no reason for players not to pick it up for themselves. I doubt you will be disappointed. Well then, if you sat through all of that, I sincerely thank you. Next time on Stiles Series Synopsis, we'll be taking a look at the game's sequel, Final Fantasy II.